Good evening and welcome to episode 66 of SCOTONOMICS. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. We are going out on Facebook, YouTube, and also on Twitter. Tonight we have a really interesting, quite short conversation, around about 35 minutes, with Sarah O'Connor, who is the Labour editor. She's also an associate editor at the Financial Times. So a really interesting interview. We covered quite a lot of topics in that short period of time. We covered a lot more than just the labour market and regulation, but we looked at the impact on the economy, and we also discussed a little bit about the Scottish economy and the fact that the Scottish Government doesn't have control of labour regulation, and that's actually a retained power in Westminster. So we spoke a little bit about that, and that's available on our SCOTONOMICS channel. We're going to upload that just after this episode. So this one's around about 35 minutes. It's nice to see you all here. Please do drop any thoughts and comments and questions. I'll be on the back watching this episode tonight. Kieran's got a meeting, so she won't be joining us, and I'll be finishing up. Just say a quick goodbye at the end of the session. But it's a really interesting episode. Now, unfortunately, we didn't have much time, Sarah and I, to have a proper conversation. So she said a few things which I disagreed with in the interview, and I've actually found some charts and graphs I'm going to drop up, which I would have used in my conversation with Sarah. So I hope she's okay with me dropping those charts on. I did want to have much more of a conversation with her. Unfortunately, we were a little bit short on time. So enjoy this episode. Please do give us your comments, and I'll see you after it for about 35 minutes. Hello, Sarah O'Connor. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about the world of work. Now, Sarah, you're a columnist, reporter, and associate editor at the Financial Times, and you write a weekly column focused on the world of work. So I couldn't think of anyone better to talk about the world of work. My first big question to you is, how different is the labour market since the start of neoliberalism in the early 1980s?
That is a big question. I'll try and cover it as briefly as possible. So it's really different. I mean, different in a number of different ways. I mean, one of the big changes that's happened is that we've sort of shifted from being an economy that had quite a lot of manufacturing to an economy that's basically a services economy. So in 1980, about a quarter of economic output, a quarter of the economy was accounted for by manufacturing. It's now only about 10%. And meanwhile, the services is the thing that's really grown. So many more people are working in the services industry. It's become much more of a services type of economy, and much more than lots of other countries in Europe as well. So that's one big change. The other big change, I suppose, is the sort of collapse in the power and the scale of trade unions. So obviously in the 70s, trade unions were really quite big and powerful. Their membership has fallen massively, as we all know. I mean, maybe it doesn't feel like it right now because they're flexing their muscles pretty effectively in terms of public sector strikes. But the public sector is really their kind of last holdout. So they're still pretty well established in public sector jobs, at least some of them. But in the private sector, trade union membership is much, much lower than it was in the late 70s and early 80s. And that obviously has a lot of knock-on effects that we can talk about. And then I suppose the other big change I would point to, among many, is the role of women in the workplace. I mean, female labour force participation has increased massively since that time. It's become much more common for couples to both be working, in late 70s, early 80s, it would have been much more common for the man to work and the woman to stay at home and look after the kids. That's far less often the case now. So you see many more women work. A lot of them are in part-time work, but not exclusively. So I say those are three of the big changes. There are plenty more, but I can't imagine we want to spend the whole podcast on that.
Yeah. So the type of work that we're doing in terms of the sector is very different, and you've also got the power of unions and the increase in the workforce from more women entering the workforce. How has this affected the wages that people have been earning since the 1980s? I mean, GDP from the 1980s to now has doubled and then doubled again. So you would imagine that the average wage would have doubled or doubled again. Could you explain where we are in terms of wages within the workforce for that start of that kind of period in the 1980s to where we are now?
Well, I mean, we are doing better, right? I mean, wages are definitely higher than they were then. I would have to go back and check the numbers, but I think we sometimes confuse what's happened over the last decade with what's happened over the longer term. So, if you think about what is often called the nice decade, so that was the sort of the decade up until the financial crisis, things were ticking along really nicely at that point. We had inflation at about 2, we had wage growth at about 4. So we had real wage growth. The amount of wages that people are getting after accounting for inflation was going up at a sort of steady, not a spectacular pace, but a steady pace. People were getting richer. Living standards were rising. Where things really started to go wrong was 2007, 2008, the start of the financial crisis, and then the decade of austerity that followed. During that period, I mean, the UK has had very little wage growth at all. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary the extent to which our living standards have kind of stagnated. And they were starting to show some signs of recovery before the pandemic. The pandemic was obviously a huge sort of shock in itself, which had actually in the end a lot of weird distributional impacts. But what we're seeing now clearly is a big fall in our wages in real terms, again, because inflation is so high. And although wages, people have managed to get pay rises this year that would be higher than usual, but they're not as high as inflation. So we are seeing our wages fall back. Now, a lot of countries had kind of pretty poor wage growth after the financial crisis, but the UK really stands out, even among other G7 countries, as having a truly terrible experience with wages and living standards. So I think your sarcasm and skepticism is justified, but probably only for the last decade and a half. Although that's long enough, let's face it.
Yeah. Well, we're now in a position where more of the benefits of the company's work is going to profits than to wages. Is that how you would read it?
So that's definitely what happened in the 80s. And, alongside that, which is actually something I should have said about the way the labour market's changed, we saw huge increases in inequality in the 80s. The gap between the rich and the poor widened. Having said that, that story that you're telling about this divergence between profits and wages and a kind of shrinking share of the pie for workers, that is true in a lot of countries, and it's definitely true in America, for example, where workers' kind of slice of that pie in the US has just been shrinking and shrinking over time. Actually, in the UK data, that's not. I mean, since the 90s, that's not really what we see. Like, it might not be how we feel about. I think a lot of people feel that that must have been happening. It's not actually how it looks, and I think that's partly because actually the economy hasn't been doing terribly well of late either. Productivity hasn't been growing terribly well. So it's not actually, recently at least, it's not actually that companies have been making out like bandits and being incredibly stingy with how much they're giving to their workers. It's more just that, we're all kind of doing terribly. I don't know if that's better or worse in your view.
I know there is some evidence of kind of profit gouging over the COVID and post-COVID period. I think there's been some good research to say that companies are saying, hey, there's a lot of inflation. We're putting up our prices, and that's not being passed on to staff. What do you think has been the kind of economic and the societal impact of those significant changes in the workforce from the 80s to where we are now?
Well, as I say, rising inequality. We're now an economy in which a small number of people can get very rich, and a larger number of people will struggle to do that. We've seen declines in social mobility. We've also seen, as a result of that shift to services, particularly financial services, and that move away from manufacturing, you've seen an economy that relies more and more upon London in particular. So London growing in kind of economic heft, and other places struggling. I think everyone now agrees, even the Conservative Party, that the parts of the country that had a lot of mining and manufacturing jobs were basically kind of left to rot after those jobs left. And no one, although plenty of people thought about the problem and tried to think of things to do, no one really ever figured out what would be the best thing to do to try and revive local economies where their kind of economic reason for being had been stripped away. So yeah, I would say a more unequal country, both sort of geographically and between rich and poor. On the more positive side, I think we're a more equal country in terms of gender balance, and that's definitely partly to do with the fact that the world of work has changed, has become much more open to women and to women sort of attaining high office. Now we're nowhere near attaining actual gender balance, but it is better than it was in the late 70s and early 80s. And as a woman, I'd rather be forging my career now than then.
Yeah, and certainly the UK does do relatively well in terms of gender balance and gender equality when you compare it to other similar nations. Of course, that was the economic deal that we did in the late 70s and the early 80s, was to say that London will forge ahead as this kind of financial services sector, and it might bring along some other places across the country. But what will happen is that wealth will be distributed across the country, and we'll all be doing well from that. But what seems to happen is the first thing went beautifully, that went fantastically well, but the second part didn't do so well. One thing that may have changed is this idea of good jobs. And we often hear that right now there's a lack of good jobs when we look back to the 1980s. And I'm thinking specifically about good working class to lower middle class jobs. Have those jobs disappeared, or are they just changed? What's the reality when people talk about there being a lot less good jobs now?
And that probably is right, because those manufacturing jobs were by and large good jobs. I mean, they weren't necessarily good in terms of they might be incredibly monotonous or quite dangerous, or involve long hours, but often they were unionized jobs. Unions have spent a long time trying to push up the wages and the safety conditions in those places. And so as those kinds of jobs disappeared, a lot of the jobs that have emerged at the kind of the lower end of the labour market are in sectors like social care, where there are very little union presence, very sort of small fragmented workforces. And fundamentally, that's a sector that is starved of adequate funding by the government, because no one can agree on how much we as taxpayers should pay for social care. And so that means that, terms and conditions in sectors like that are terrible. It's basically minimum wage work. Often people don't get paid for the time they spend traveling between different elderly people's houses.
Mm-hmm.
0-hour contracts are very prevalent. So that would be one example, but there are others. People often talk about Amazon. I mean, Amazon is a drop in the ocean in terms of total UK employment, but it's maybe sort of emblematic of a new type of job that has emerged, which is similar to manufacturing in some ways, in that it's quite routine, it's quite controlled, you have a lot of autonomy, but what it hasn't come with is particularly good pay, particularly good conditions. Unions have struggled to get any kind of foothold in Amazon warehouses, subject to kind of electronic and algorithmic control and surveillance, which is something new, and a lot of workers are kind of chafing under those conditions.
Reading between the lines, it sounds like you're saying unions equal better jobs. Is it as simple as that, do you think?
Well, I mean, that's what they exist for. Whether they always sort of succeed is maybe an open question, but that is indeed what unions are trying to do. And it is definitely true that sectors which have a higher union presence usually have higher wages and better terms and conditions.
Because what's quite interesting, you've outlined all of the problems that we've got now when we've moved away from good jobs, and they have developed with a government framework that could actually change the way that those jobs are designed. So what you're saying is that their conditions are good. The pay is not so good. There's not much security in those jobs. Those are all things that the institution of the labour market, as controlled by the government, can affect. So are you saying that those are things that the government has just decided not to play a particularly large role in?
Well, I mean, the government has tried to address this to a certain extent, right? Because the UK government has pushed the minimum wage very hard, much harder than I think most people would have expected. Now, there are still people who say it ought to be higher, including the kind of opposition Labour Party. But the UK minimum wage has gone up much faster than average earnings. And actually, it was George Osborne who decided to try and kind of accelerate the pace at which it was rising. And I think that was probably in response to this sense that a lot of people had that actually the labour market wasn't really working well for people right at the bottom, and that this was a problem. What I would say is that the minimum wage is only one part of what makes a job decent. So, you know, increasing the minimum wage is fine, and it's better than not increasing it, but it's still not, you know, it's not now kind of equal to the sort of real living wage, which is the sort of calculated level it would need to be to guarantee like a decent standard of living. But alongside that, you know, changing the minimum wage rate does nothing to affect the conditions under which people are working. It doesn't affect whether someone's on a 0 hours contract, whether they get a text message at 10 o'clock at night on Sunday to tell them whether they've got a shift on Monday or not. You know, and those things can often have a much bigger effect on someone's living standards, and also like their mental health, their ability to care for their children, their ability to like just keep all of the plates spinning in the air. So I would say, you know, it's not that the government has done nothing, but I think what they've done is inadequate to the challenges.
I had a specific question around this idea of automation and robotics, and in particular AI, because I think that's the thing that seems different from everything else. And my understanding is that automation and robotics has kind of replaced physical work, whereas AI is starting to replace, you know, the brain and a very, very different part of the process of work. So what impact have these things been having on the workforce over the last couple of decades, and what impact do you think AI is going to have as we look into the future?
It's a really good question. You know, probably we've been talking about the big wave of AI for about 10 years now. It's probably 10 years ago that some economists came out with predictions that maybe sort of 40% of jobs would be displaced by AI. Like that clearly hasn't happened yet, right? I mean, we have labor shortages right now. We have a shortage of people to do all of the work that's available, not the opposite. Having said that, you know, I think some of the things that have emerged more recently, like generative AI, these chatbots like ChatGPT, which has suddenly sort of burst into the human consciousness.
Yeah.
I mean, it does feel like something different, I think. I was talking recently with Alan Manning, who's a labour market economist at the LSE, and he was sort of saying the usual economist line, which is that you know, automation, whether it's AI, whether it's robotics, whatever it is, ultimately, you know, it creates winners and losers, but everyone wins in the end because it makes certain things easier and cheaper to do, and that means that we all benefit. And there will be some specific people who lose out because they had a skill or a physical ability that has now been supplanted. But that overall things get better and people find new jobs to do and the economy adjusts. So I think that will be that's the kind of standard economist line.
Yeah, that's kind of techno utopian, isn't it?
I don't know if it's techno-utopian. I think it's just, you know, that is basically what has happened throughout history. Economy, you know, technological change has been massively disruptive. It has kind of destroyed people's livelihoods, but ultimately it certainly hasn't led to kind of widespread unemployment, has it? At least so far.
Yeah.
What I would say is, like, I think as you alluded to, this new kind of generative AI feels a bit different because it feels as if it's coming after the types of skills that we used to think were kind of uniquely human. And that maybe feels a bit more threatening because, you know, things like creativity, those are the parts of our jobs that we often like to do.
Yeah.
So I used to think about if AI was able to do elements of journalism, I used to think, okay, well, maybe that would be fine. You know, maybe it could do the really boring bits where it just gathers a few facts, and then it would, you know, I could spend more time doing the bit that I really like, which is writing. And more recently, I've started to think, God, what if actually the AI takes over the fun bit? What if it does the writing and I'm reduced to kind of fact checking it, basically? You know? And I think that can happen. You know, that has happened in the past, where it's often said that automation takes away the boring parts of people's jobs, but it doesn't always work like that. Sometimes actually what happens is it takes away the more interesting parts of people's jobs, and what are left are tasks that are pretty simple, that you can hire sort of less qualified people to do. And that works brilliantly for companies because everything becomes much cheaper, but it doesn't necessarily work brilliantly for people. people often think about the impact of AI in terms of like the number of jobs, or like will you lose your job to a robot? That's the way it's often framed. Whereas I think we probably need to think a lot more now about how is this going to change the way we do our jobs? How is it going to change the quality of work? And it's not necessarily a given that it will change it for the better. It might, but that's probably within our power, and we probably need to think about shaping the policy landscape such that it does make work better rather than worse.
Yeah. Well, that leads beautifully into another big question for you, which is if we're restructuring the way that we do work and also the way that we earn, because obviously that's why you work, to earn money. There's three policies that people discuss, and these aren't exclusive, saying everyone stops working and these three things happen, but they're policies to kind of augment the normal world of work. And we've got a job guarantee scheme, a universal basic income, and this idea of kind of like a data dividend, or taking a percentage of shares from the most successful companies and spreading that out across society. What are your thoughts on those three things?
I'm not totally convinced that any of them are gonna be particularly effective. I mean, so basic income, I like the idea of it. I like the idea that if you take away the jeopardy, the fear that if you lose your job, you're going to be close to the poverty line, that is a positive. That not everyone necessarily wants to do paid work, and that there are lots of other kinds of work that are valuable to society, whether that's caring for people, whether that's doing something artistic. There are lots of ways to find meaning in life that aren't work. So I agree with all of that, but there are two reservations I have. One is that I really still haven't seen any calculations on how it would be possible to create a basic income that is high enough that it actually works for people, is that it actually kind of guarantees that they don't have to work if they don't want to. Like how do you do that without kind of raising taxes to such an extent that actually no one would tolerate it? I haven't really seen any fiscal maths that really shows me how it would work. And if you end up doing a universal basic income that's just set really low, then I think it loses a lot of the value that it has, and you basically then end up taking away benefits from. At the minute, we have a benefit system that targets extra benefits on people who have more needs, whether they're disabled, whether they have health issues, whether they have more children, and there's a reason for that, which is that you're much more likely to be in poverty if you have higher needs. So having a flat basic income is fine, but it has to be set high enough to meet everyone's needs, and that's just a high bar, I think. So that's one reservation. The other is that I just wonder sometimes if it kind of lets employers off the hook. I'm always skeptical of ideas that Silicon Valley billionaires support, and Silicon Valley billionaires really
It's
support this
unusual, the
idea.
UBI. It's got support right across the left and the right, doesn't it? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
You're
So
skeptical of that.
the reason that the Silicon Valley billionaires like it, I think, is that it basically kind of takes away any sense that it's an employer's responsibility to give you a job that you can live off, to give you a job that has secure hours, that has a decent wage. Because if everyone is getting a decent payoff anyway from the state, then actually an employer can just pick you up and drop you at a moment's notice. An employer doesn't have to pay you very much if it doesn't want to. An employer doesn't have to guarantee that you're going to get any particular number of hours a week. And maybe that doesn't matter. Maybe that's fine. Maybe people won't mind. But I feel like that's a lot. We've spent hundreds of years trying to persuade employers that they do have responsibilities in these areas. So I think that would be quite a big step to take. So that's my other reservation with it. Job guarantee. I think that's fine in times of like the high unemployment as a sort of counter-cyclical policy. Obviously, the most famous example would be Roosevelt in the Great Depression. The people who were given work by the state went on to do lots of great things that were useful for the country, and it certainly helped stave off kind of mass destitution. Well, it would have been worse without it, put it that way. But I don't know whether it's a kind of overarching solution to all of the problems in the world of work. I don't think it is. And also, it's not really a solution to the problems of the world of work that we have right now. Right now we don't really have a lack of jobs. That's, in a way we have the opposite problem in lots of countries, which is a lack of workers. And the people who are sort of unemployed or out of the workforce, it's not necessarily because there are no jobs available. it's because they're maybe not well enough to take those jobs at the minute, or the jobs are not flexible enough, or are not in the right places. So I'm fine with that idea, but I don't think it's a kind of silver bullet solution. I don't know much about this idea of a data dividend, to be honest. I've not read much about it.
The concept of this data dividend is that there's these companies that are using AI automation, and they're making a huge amount of money, but we're effectively taxing them back to a huge degree to be able to pay. That's where we're earning from. So almost like they're working for society, those big companies, and they kind of justified it by saying, well, it's actually my data that you're using and mining and creating all your products from. So there's some payment that should be come back. I mean, it sounds like a different way to deliver a UBI. And that sounds like the concept, but I think that leads on from that conversation around AI. Will we be in a situation where we don't have enough jobs, and that there aren't enough jobs, and we've got to earn? And I think that's where that one's looking towards.
Yeah, so maybe if we find ourselves in that situation, then that's a good place to look. But I would just say that's completely not the kind of we've got a lot of labour market problems right now, but a lack of jobs is not one of them.
Okay, great. As you know, in the UK, labour market regulations are a retained power, so it rests in Westminster, not in Scotland. How fundamental is control of the labour market if you want to achieve broad economic and societal goals? Can you really control an economy and create the type of society you want if you don't have control over labour markets and labour regulation?
I think it is quite fundamental. I mean, maybe I'm biased because labour markets is what I write about all day, but I do think it's, that is really such a huge part of what an economy is. What people do for their jobs, how much they're paid, how well they're protected at work, what their rights are if they get into any trouble. Those are like really important things, and they can shape the way economies work. And if you look at, the US is a really good example, where different states in the US have quite different labour market rules and regulations, including, some states have quite high minimum wages, $15 an hour or more. Others have just the federal minimum wage, which is next to nothing. California has like completely banned all kinds of terms and conditions in people's contracts that stop them moving easily between jobs. Non-compete clauses, they're often called. Basically, it's a way of the employer trying to stop workers from going to work for a competitor straight after they leave. California.
And I read your article on that, and it's quite a low level as well, isn't it? It isn't the kind of gardening leave for the senior executives. It can be fairly low level, where they're saying you can't work for a competitor within 100 miles within 3 years, and employees have got to sign these contracts to get jobs. So it's
and it can be like security guards or people who work in fast food restaurants. I mean, a lot of employers have kind of massively overreached with who they're applying these to. But the reason I bring that up is that California for a long time has said, like, we just won't enforce any of this stuff. Like, we don't believe in it. We don't believe in restricting people like that. And a lot of economists would say that that's probably why, or part of the reason why, the Californian economy has done well. Why it's become very innovative, why Silicon Valley has prospered, and there's so many entrepreneurs are there, because people do have the flexibility to move, and it means that ideas are free to flow around. So I only bring that up as an example of how something that might look quite small in terms of the labour market regulation can have quite big effects on the way an economy works.
Yeah, and that's really looking at a job being so much more than just a job. And without having control of that, it does impact the economy, but also, as you said, the society. And there's been a really good results are just out for the UK's first detailed medium-size research on 4-day week. And as a perfect example, the Scottish government doesn't have the authority to introduce those types of regulations to impose a 4-day week, but the UK government would be able to do that. And it's had, although it's quite a small sample, it's had very positive results. So that'd be an example of something that a lower level of government couldn't do, which would impact society. Have you any thoughts on a 4-day week?
Yeah, I found the trial really interesting. I mean, we should say that it's kind of small, like it's like 60 companies that have tried it. So,
It was a
and
couple of months
it,
as well, so it wasn't a
yeah,
huge
it's a few months, and
time.
they're self-selecting, so they were ones who were interested in trying it. But the results have been positive, and I've talked to some CEOs of the companies who've been in the trial. And by and large, they found that people quite liked it, that it turned out that it was possible to do 5 days work in 4 days. I mean, I think it really depends on what kind of job you're doing, what kind of sector you're in. I don't think it necessarily would work equally well for everyone. But I do think there's a particular kind of white collar work that basically just expands to fill the space available.
We've all been
You
in
know,
those companies, Sarah. We've all probably had those jobs as well,
exactly. Yeah. I mean, I always think of it a bit like when you're packing a suitcase to go on holiday. Like you will always fill that suitcase, no matter how big or small it is. It will get filled if you have the suitcase there. So I think there's something to be said for saying, actually, we want to change the balance of work and leisure, and this is one way of doing it. Clearly there've been all kinds of sort of practical hurdles that have come up that have needed to be overcome. It hasn't worked for everyone. I think some employees have found it quite stressful trying to cram all of their work into 4 days, that they've felt that maybe some of the things that have been lost have been like, feeling like you've got time to stand around and have a cup of tea and chat with your colleagues, and that the pace of work feels like it's a bit more intense. But I think that the good thing about it is that um, for a long time the length of our working weeks was declining, and it sort of leveled off and hasn't really declined for quite a long time. And meanwhile, the amount of time we actually spend on leisure has been shrinking. And that's partly because we're all spending more time on childcare and other stuff. Which is weird in a way, because it's not like we didn't have children in the past, but I think maybe we just didn't sort of do childcare in such an intensive
We
way
didn't
in
do
the past. The
that.
kids were just sort of like in the background, maybe, I don't know. But I think a lot of people feel squeezed for time all the time, and that they don't have as much time for themselves, to just relax or just do what they want to do or spend time with friends and family. So thinking about how to make life better for people is always worth doing, I think.
I think that the labour force is going to and be spending a lot of time mitigating and adapting to climate change. And I think this isn't just the global south. This is global north. This is a whole planet. Have you got any thoughts on how we would start to manage and resource a large part of our workforce dedicated to something that they've never really had to dedicate that time to before? And also, I suppose, firstly, do you think that's actually likely to happen? And if you do, can you envisage any way where our economy moves to having a big workforce tackling the climate crisis?
I hope so, but I'm slightly worried that it feels as if we already need that and we haven't sort of managed to create it so far. I mean, even just think about insulating people's homes properly. I mean, that was such a no-brainer, particularly going into the Ukraine crisis and rising gas prices. But the government was pretty dreadful in terms of trying to get things together, and part of the problem there is a lack of workforce. Now, there are plenty of people around who would like to have jobs doing things like that. So it's really about setting the incentives, keeping them steady, giving businesses, giving employers like a sense of this is what's going to happen. And if there's going to be subsidies involved, they will continue for the long term, so that people actually feel the confidence to go out and hire apprentices and train them up in certain skills, because they know there's going to be a long-term market there. And I think, with that example, that's kind of what went wrong. Various voucher schemes were introduced and then scrapped. People would hire apprentices thinking there was going to be lots of work, and then there wasn't, and they have to let them go. The sort of slightly chaotic policy making. But yeah, I mean, I think in the long run, we obviously are going to need lots of workers working on this, and we are seeing it. We are seeing it happen. There are so many more people now installing solar panels, for example, than there would have been 10 or 15 years ago. So yeah, so I think it will happen in the long run, but it would be helpful if policy was trying to give it a shove in the right direction.
Yeah, because this is one of the big drivers for the issue we spoke about earlier, which is the job guarantee scheme, where it's actually saying all these jobs need need to be done, and you can't really, you can't charge the sea a fee for it hitting the sea wall that you've had to build. There's no profit in these types of enterprises, so people have to be paid, and we have to move a lot more jobs out of the private sector into the public sector for a lot of these roles. Not so many jobs that are likely to be needed that move us away from this world of consumption, because that's where the profit comes from, the consumption, rather than the reuse. So I think it's possible that we could be looking at a very different labour market, in 10 to 15 years. Have you any thoughts about the value of the work that mainly women do that's not included in our kind of official measures of productive labour?
Yeah, I mean, it's long been a very sort of controversial debate over, what kind of activity counts towards GDP and what kind of activity doesn't count. It really annoys me that in official statistics, and economists will class someone as economically inactive if they're staying at home to look after children or their elderly parents, because I wrote in a column a while back that when I was on mat leave, if someone had called me economically inactive, I think I would have punched them in the face. So I think I mean, it's very difficult to know where the boundary should be drawn, and there are lots of interesting academic debates about that. But definitely, I think we undervalue in this country, and maybe because it's not in our economic statistics in any way, we undervalue the amount of care that people provide to each other, which isn't for payment, and is really important, as we found out during the pandemic.
Yeah, and that just points to the weakness of GDP as a measure, because that type of labour would never be counted because it's not producing anything, and that's what GDP is. It's the amount of throughput of an economy. Whereas we need another measure that starts to value what people are doing through their productiveness to the society, as well as to the consumer on the goods that they're producing. So thanks very much for joining us. It's been great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it.